Quick warning, friends, today's video does contain very intense subject matter that some people will find disturbing, including some mentions of assault and implied sexual assault, so viewer discretion is highly advised for this one. And of course, thank you for listening. I have a weird situation that I wanted to tell about my life from when I was younger. I'm female, currently 33 years old, and I have a brother that is 2 years older than me. When we were children, I always felt like my brother hated me with a passion. Like, for some reason, he was hell-bent on ruining my life and making me feel like a terrible person. However, the more I've been reading stories about demons and possessive entities that attach to not just people, but bloodlines, I'm starting to wonder if everything he did was by his own doing, or if something out there was guiding his hand. For the story, we're just going to call my brother Kay. Growing up, Kay was horribly aggressive and abusive towards me, but he wasn't always like that. For the first few years of my life that I can remember, Kay was actually the most loving brother that ever existed. My mother had photos and videos of him holding me as a baby, of him telling her how beautiful I was, and the video that I hold closest to my heart is one from the day that I was born. Mom was still in the hospital after giving birth to me, and my dad had brought Kay into the room a while after everything was settled, and he looked at me, and then to the camera that my dad was holding and said, "That's my little sister?" My dad said that I was, and he just smiled, turned to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I love her." It's the cutest thing in the world to me, and it honestly makes it even more painful when I think about how things went later on. I have to add a bit more context to my family, so do bear with me. First off, my grandfather and who he was. From what I've been told, my grandfather was a very hard-working man that did everything for his family, and he was part of the generation that worked hard manual labor day in and day out for 50 years straight. When he retired from work, he seemed to have lost all sense of purpose, and then became an aggressive and violent man. Not just to my grandmother, but also to my mother. It was like losing his job caused a switch to just flip, and he turned into a horrible man overnight. He, however, loved my little brother more than anything. Every time he saw him, he would light up and nothing else in the world would exist for those few moments. Now, when I was born, he had the opposite reaction to me. He never wanted me around. If I was there, he would yell at my mother to shut me up or leave me outside. Yeah, he literally told her to leave a newborn child outside if she came over. Well, about 3 years into my life, my grandfather died. There was a small funeral. Us kids weren't there, but my mom told me that my grandmother seemed like she wasn't even hurt that her husband of 55 years had died. In fact, she seemed happy. And she actually smiled after the whole thing was over. This, however, was where things started for me. My brother didn't really understand that my grandfather had died. My mom talked to him about it, telling him about life and death, but he was 5, so it wasn't really a concept that he could grasp. Basically, it was just a situation of, he's gone, we're sad, but life goes on. That was when things started to change with Kay. After my grandfather passed, he started to become an aggressive and violent child. He would scream at my mother any time she tried to talk to him. He would destroy things if he could get his hands on them, and his attitude towards me did a full 180. The first instance was when I was still 3. My mother said that she heard me doing my best to have a conversation with him while we were in our room. He was laughing and talking to me as well. Then she said that he went quiet, and I kept saying his name in a way that was like I was asking for him, and then about 5 or 10 minutes later, I started screaming. She ran into the room and saw what had happened. Kay was sitting on my bed with me. My hands were covered in blood, and there was a very large, very sharp knife sitting in front of me. My mom was obviously panicked and screamed for my dad, who came in and grabbed Kay while my mom helped me. I had a cut across both my hands, and I was bleeding pretty bad for a small kid. My dad asked Kay what happened and how I got the knife, and he said that Kay told him that he got the knife for me. He said that I needed it, that I needed to bleed. He then said that Grandpa told him to give me the knife to play with because it was what I deserved. This obviously freaked my dad out, and after this we weren't allowed to play in my room unsupervised anymore. A few months after this, in the middle of the night, my mom said that she heard me screaming and crying, and she got up to check on me when she saw Kay standing over me holding a stuffed animal over my face and saying something like, "It's okay, it won't hurt," over and over. Once again, my dad tried to figure out what was going on with him, and he just told him that Grandpa wanted me to stop breathing because I was being too loud. Things like this happened a few times when I was young, but as the two of us got older, he stopped physically hurting me and started emotionally lashing out at me. I remember very vividly on my 12th birthday, making Kay 14 at the time, he had actually walked into the room where my friends were with my dad's handgun. He then placed it on the table in front of us, and he set it directly in front of me, and then looked me straight in the face and said, "You should end your life. No one here likes you, and no one here wants you around. You're nothing but a burden on everyone here, and we would all be very much better off without you." I can't even begin to explain the emotional pain that situation caused. Not only had he hurt me personally, but to do this in front of my few friends and on my birthday. Agony is the only word that comes close to how I felt. When my dad came back in with the cake and saw the look on my face, his face, and then noticed the shock on the other girls' faces, and then finally saw the gun, he went off on Kay. He placed the cake down, grabbed the gun, and I remember him screaming at Kay about the situation. He asked him how he got the gun from the safe, and Kay just said that Grandpa told him the combination because he wanted him to give me the gun. I remember my dad yelling non-stop in the other room while I just stared at my cake and cried. My mom did her best to try and steer us back on track, but the party was effectively ruined, and my friends were pretty freaked out. Rightfully so. There were a few more things that happened between Kay and I, a few events where he hit me and he did everything he could to make me feel pain, mentally, physically, emotionally. He made my life hell for so many years, and I'll never forgive him for all that he did to me. But part of me does kind of think that it wasn't all him, that there was something else that pushed him to do this. And that's based on what occurred a bit later. The last time that I saw Kay was when I was 17. And while I don't want anything to do with him, that actually wasn't by my choice. He was 19 and still living at the house, but he had managed to get a job and save up money to get a car. Then, he packed up his stuff, and he left. As in, he packed his clothes, got in his car, and no one has seen him since then. Like I said, I'm 33 now, so you can do the math on when that was, but it has been a very long time. And my guess is that he's either no longer alive or living under a different name or whatever. The reason I feel like he may not have been in control the entire time was because of the note that he left behind. He actually wrote that he was sorry for hurting me. I actually still have the note somewhere, but a good summary of it was that he loved me and that he never wanted to cause me pain, but he always felt like he had to. He mentioned in it that something in him wanted me to hurt, but that the other part of him wanted to protect me, and he never seemed to win when the two sides would clash. It hurts me to think that there was a part of him that did love me, that wanted what was best for me, but then the other part felt compelled to cause me so much harm. I also hate to think that he was being controlled by a demon, or my grandfather, or something, and that because of that evil entity, I never had the life with my brother that I should have. I will never forgive him for all that he did. It really affected me well into my adult life, but I feel like I understand it a little bit more. If he's still out there, I hope he got away from whatever evil thing had its grip over him. And I want him to know that I do have a happy life. And if the trauma he caused me ever weighs heavy on him, he can be sure that I'm no longer held back by the agony that he caused me throughout my childhood. Back when I was in my early 20s, my best buddy, Lawrence, and I used to do a lot of urban exploration in places that were completely abandoned, run down, or just really, really old. Most of the places we went were just a shell of what they once were, but it was really fun to just check the buildings out and see what we could find, and what kind of tags were left behind. I know it sounds weird, but I've always had a bit of a thing for architectural photography, which included the buildings that were basically nothing more than a pile of detritus, and I was always willing to check out new spots and see what kind of pics I could get. The event that happened took place in, I believe, the summer of 2007. Lawrence and I had a few places that we wanted to check out that he had done some research on, and gotten info through other urbex enthusiasts. They were across a couple states, so we decided that we would split them up over a couple of months when we could get the time off work to go out to them. None of them were more than a few hours away, but, adult life and all that. The first one we went to was a bit creepy, but didn't have much to report other than being really run down. It is the second one that actually had the most going for it. For the sake of not giving away the exact location, I'm just going to make up a name for the place and call it Sunny Days Youth Camp. Now, Sunny Days Youth Camp was a religious summer camp type of place that was, at one time, pretty big. As the years had gone by, they had been wrapped up in a number of scandals and things that really shouldn't have been happening at a youth camp, especially a religious one, including one of their youth pastors walking out into the woods on a random day of the camp and deciding to end his life in a very gruesome manner. After that happened and became a pretty big deal locally, the people at the top decided that there wasn't much they could do to save face. So they locked the doors and basically abandoned the camp. And that's the backstory of the place. It was pretty messed up, and it had been empty for quite a while. And, as such, Lawrence and I had added it to be the second stop on our list that summer. When we got to the area, it looked pretty well abandoned. It was actually pretty hard to find as it was overgrown and barely marked. However, most of the front gate was still there, so you could tell that something was there at one time. Based on this information that we had, this was where Sunny Days was supposed to be, so we just went for it. We had to park at the gate because of the growth, but it wasn't too far of a walk to the actual building. The main building that was in the center was marked as the Counselor's Lodge, and it was pretty boring. It was mostly just an empty husk of what it once was. Fake log cabin-looking walls covered in old, faded posters, citing certain Bible verses, and of course the Code of Conduct. There wasn't much there. The second building we went to was one of the lodges for the kids, and that's where I started to feel uneasy. The room felt incredibly heavy, like the air was almost hard to breathe, and it was almost cold. And this was in the middle of the summer, sitting at a comfortable 85 degrees outside, but this building felt a lot colder, like it was in the 50s or so. We walked around a bit, but within a short amount of time, I started feeling like I wanted to pass out. If you've ever passed out, you know that weird tunnel vision-like feeling you get, and how you struggle to focus on one thing at a time while your hearing goes hollow? Yeah, it was that. I told Lawrence that I needed to take a moment, and he came over to help me sit down, asking what was wrong. I told him that I felt faint, like I was going to pass out. He asked if it was just anxiety, and I told him that I didn't know. I was feeling fine until we got in here. He told me to go ahead and sit there until I got better, and I asked him to take my camera to get some shots for me. And he agreed, and I sat there and he kept walking on into the building, taking photo after photo. I honestly thought that I had sat there for almost half an hour. It felt like he was taking forever, but then he came back and told me that he had only been gone for about 3 minutes. I knew then that I wasn't doing well, because that 3 minutes felt like ages. What was worse, the second we stepped out of that building, I was feeling better. Like, the literal first step out of the building onto the dirt, I was feeling back to 100%. I asked him for my camera, so I could see the pictures that he took, and he handed it back. I remember scrolling through the shots, and I got to one that he took of me sitting on the bed in the front corner, and it was the creepiest thing. I looked pale and sickly, which made sense, but in the picture, you could see what looked like the outline of a man standing right behind me with his hand on my shoulder. He was completely black with no real features, but it was pretty clear that this was a humanoid shape that was touching me. I wish I still had these pictures, honestly, because they were terrifying, but this was 15 years ago and that camera's long gone, as well as my computer. But I digress. We looked over the shots, and that was the only one that we saw anything weird in that building. We decided that we would check out the last building really quick and then call it a day. The last building was the quote-unquote activity center, and it was a bit away from the other two. Like, maybe a couple 100 feet. As we got close, once again, I started feeling like there was something severely wrong with this place. It just felt like it had this grossly negative presence that resided within it. Like something was there that had the most ill intentions possible. I mentioned to Lawrence that this building felt off too, and he said I could stay outside while he got the shots if I wanted. I thought about it, but I said that I would go in with him and just leave if it got to be too much. Well, as it is, neither of us actually went into the building. We opened the door, and we were hit with a blast of freezing air, and then the smell of sulfur. We both just stood by the entryway staring in, and I could tell that we were both debating and waiting for the other to go inside, or say something, but for several seconds neither of us did. I just aimed my camera and took a picture really quick. I swear, as soon as I hit the button and the flash went off, we both heard what sounded like a deep, guttural hissing sound. As soon as that happened, we noped out of there. We shut the door, and we decided that we were going to call it right then and there. I don't want to stretch the story too much longer than it has been, mostly because that's the core of what happened. But there was a bit more that actually took place afterwards. A few days after we got back home from the trip, Lawrence actually got really sick with flu-like symptoms, but worse than any flu that I've ever had. He had a really bad fever. He said he was in immense pain the entire time, and he couldn't keep down food or water. He said that while he struggled to sleep every time he would doze off, he kept having these weird dreams where he was being slaughtered, and they all took place at sunny days. It was like he was dreaming that he was in the activity building, and something there was attacking him, tearing his skin, cutting him, and he said that every single dream ended in him bleeding out and dying. I will say that this could have been coincidental, but I have heard of demons having residual effects on people that encounter them, and I have to say that I'm pretty certain that place was inhabited by some kind of demon. Lawrence did get better after a week or so, and thankfully the nightmares stopped as well. That said, we never went back to that place, nor have we told anyone where it is. I don't even know if the buildings are still there, but if they are, I hope that no one ever finds them. That place had a really bad history, and there are certainly some negative, and I would say demonic, energies that have attached to it. I'm glad that we got out mostly unscathed, but I'm also terrified about what could have happened if he had actually gone into that last building. Part of me is fairly certain that, had we gone in, that thing would have attached onto one of us. And that scares the hell out of me. Way back when I was a kid, between the ages of 6 all the way to the time I was 12, I lived with my grandparents at their house in the suburbs of Missouri. This house was more or less ancient. I have no idea when it was built, but thinking back on it now, the structures were definitely dated, and the overall setup for the house was definitely old-fashioned. For those 6 years, it was myself, my mother, and then my younger brother that all lived there, with him coming into the picture a year or so before we moved out into our own place. My father was an incredibly drunk and abusive man, and we ended up having to move into my grandparents' house after he attacked my mother, and I tried to intervene. Like I said, I was 6, so there was no way I was going to be able to stop him, or even slow him down. But he decided that he needed to treat me like a threat and defend himself. Thankfully, that was the end of it for my mom, and she took the proper legal actions to get him out of our life, and we got out of that house. Of course, living with my grandparents, it wasn't really ideal. Their house wasn't huge by any definition of the word, and my mom was sleeping in an unfinished basement while they set up my bed in what they called the guest room. I'm not sure what guest would have wanted to stay in the room, because it had just enough space for my child-sized bed, a single dresser, and my tiny toy chest, and that was about it. But it was where I called home for a significant portion of my childhood, and I'm thankful that we had a place to sleep at night. Though that's where things kind of got sketchy. Sleeping, that is. When we first moved into the house, I had a lot of trouble sleeping in my room. It was a long time ago, so a lot of what happened in the beginning were things that I was told by my mother. She told me that for the first couple of months of us living there, I would sleepwalk. The first time it happened, I had seemingly just gotten up out of bed, left the guest room and walked down to her bedroom, and just stood there in the doorway staring at her. She said that when she asked me if I was okay, I just stared and said that I needed to make sure nothing happened to her. Now, this was right after we had moved in, so not long after the event with my father took place, and she assumed it was just some kind of traumatic response to the event. She let me sleep in her bed with her. Then, the next time that it happened, she told me that she actually found me outside of the house, in the backyard, just staring out into the yard. I wasn't saying anything. I didn't seem scared or angry. I was literally just standing there and staring out into the night. And, once again, when she came out and asked what I was doing, I just said that I was watching. I wouldn't say what I was watching, though. After this, my grandparents installed a lock on the exterior door that was too high for me to reach, so I never went back outside. But I did sleepwalk a few more times after this. It was more of the same, just me saying that I was checking in on my mom, watching, staring out the window. Weird stuff for sure, but it wasn't where it all ended. This is actually where my memory comes into play, because I remember all of what happened after this very vividly. I would randomly start having these horrifying nightmares about various things, but they would always involve my dad. In these nightmares, it was always me at my dad's house. I would be sitting there and my father would walk into the room with an angry look on his face, but something about him didn't seem right. He was angry, but he almost looked devilishly angry. Like, he almost looked demonic. Much like I was doing when I was sleepwalking, in the dreams, he would just stand in the far corner of the room watching me. And when I asked him what he was doing, he would tell me that he was waiting. These nightmares were mostly uneventful beyond this, but something about them always launched me into waking up screaming. My mom would have to run into my room and comfort me for what seemed like forever to get me back to sleep. And when she would ask me what was wrong, I would always tell her that Daddy was watching me. These weird dreams apparently went on for almost a year, when things started escalating in both my life and in my nightmares. Around this time, my father decided that he was tired of playing my mother's games, and he was trying to force himself back into our lives. He kept playing the "I want to see my son" card, because my mother hadn't gone through any legal custody claim, and it was really difficult for her to tell him no. I hated being around him when I was that age, because every single time I would see him, I would just start to feel this horrible fear that something was happening. Being 7, I didn't know what existential dread felt like, but it was kind of like that. Like this horrible feeling that the situation I was in was bad and was only getting worse the longer that I was in it. During this time, the dreams with my father grew darker. He would always be staring at me, telling me that he just wanted to be closer to me in them. Thinking back, this is when I realized it wasn't my father in my dreams, but some kind of entity or demon that was watching me in the form of my father. At this point, I never wanted to sleep, and being a young kid, not sleeping really isn't easy. My mother would try to talk to me as best she could about the whole thing. She would try to help me understand that they were just dreams and that they would eventually pass. I tried to tell her that they weren't just dreams, that this thing was trying to hurt me, but she didn't want to entertain the thought. Around my 8th birthday was when everything came to a head. My father was more pushy about seeing me, and once a week had become several times a week. He would come into the house and would try to get my mom alone in her room, and I don't want to get into what I think happened when that happened. But then he would also come sit in my room and just sit there on the bed while I sat on my toy chest. These were the worst times, because he would not say anything. He would just stare at me and go through what looked like an entire cycle of emotions. He would look like he was mad at me. He would start crying, laughing, and it was terrifying. The last time he came over, we went through the same cycle as always. He came in and just sat there. But I was at a point where I'd had enough of this and asked him why he never wanted to talk to me. He told me to hush because he was thinking. Of course, I was 8, and I was starting to be the snappy preteen that kids so often become, and I basically said that it was creepy how he just stared at me. Then, he hit me. He smacked me across the face hard enough to leave my cheek red, and then grabbed me by the shoulders and told me that I needed to never speak to him again like that. I remember that feeling. The pain on my face, the anger on his face while he shook me and said that. I remember that horrible fear as I held back from crying and he just stared at me in the eyes. I just said I was sorry and I didn't know what else to say or do. I remember then seeing his eyes as he stared at me. Something felt different. He felt like he used to in my dreams, like a monster. For that split second, I was more terrified than I had ever been. And then he seemed like himself again. He let go of me and he started to leave, and that was one of the few times that he told me that he loved me. And then he was gone. 2 things happened that night. The first one I'll mention is the dream that I had. It was similar to the other dreams that I would have about my father, except this time, he wasn't just standing there and staring at me. He was sitting on the floor. The house wasn't our house as I remembered it. It was trashed and dark. I just remember that he was sitting there on the floor holding his knees and crying. I asked him what happened, and why he was so upset, and the words that I got in return have always haunted me. I let it win. For some reason, I knew what it was that he was talking about. It was that demon that had been haunting me ever since we moved out of the house. The demon that was haunting him. I don't know why, but in the dream I felt compelled to forgive him. So I did. I told him that it was okay, that I knew that it wasn't his fault. That was pretty much the end of the dream. Nothing else really happened past that, but then the morning came, and when I got up, I found my mom crying at the kitchen table. As I came to find out, my father had passed away that night, and as was explained to me much later in life, he had actually ended his own life. He didn't leave a note or tell anyone what was going on. He just went through with his plan, and his neighbors called the cops because they heard it. At the age that I was, I knew what death was, but I wasn't at the point where it really hit me that he was gone until a bit later. That night was actually the last time that I had one of those dreams with him in it. I never had another nightmare about him watching me, or even one like I did that night. Now, I don't know if this was demonic possession, and I'm not trying to make an excuse or rationalize what he did, but part of me feels like my father's aggression wasn't always his. He was not a good man. He drank a lot, and like I said, he attacked both me and my mother, but part of me feels like something else was controlling him. The fact that he had hit me that day and his whole demeanor changed, followed by the weird dream with him telling me that it won, it just makes me feel like there was more to this. Regardless, I do hope that my father is able to rest. And while he may have ruined part of my childhood, and part of me will always pull those bad memories to the front, the other part of me does want him to know that I do forgive him. This is my first time ever really putting this story out into the world, but I figured it was a good idea to share my experience. I went through all of this, and it was a pretty intense time in my life, so maybe it's best to just get it off my chest at some point, and now seems as good a time as any. When I was young, my mother was pretty heavy into the occult and claimed herself to be a practicing witch. Whether or not that's related is completely up to you on whether or not you think that stuff is real, or has any effect on people around those that are practicing. But because of that, us kids were always hyper aware of the supernatural side of things. We were aware of ghosts, hauntings, demons, and all that, and I've always had a pretty strong belief in the paranormal. And I'm pretty sure we had a haunted house back then, but that's not really here nor there. A little context on who I was at the time. I'm female, and when this all happened, I believe I was just turning 16. Because of my mother's obsession with dark things, I do not scare easily. Mostly because she always had a word to say about anything scary or strange. I have a pretty solid foundation, and there's very little that'll make me jump, flinch, cringe, or be otherwise afraid. My sister, on the other hand, seemed to have been the opposite growing up, in that you could make her jump and scream by just going, "Ah!" really loudly at her, even if she knew you were there the entire time. Growing up, the house we lived in was only a 2-bedroom, so it was always a struggle with my younger sister about the room. I was 16, she was 14, and it was a pain to have to sleep there with her in the room because she had no respect for privacy at all. I hit a point where I was pretty tired of being in the same room as her, so I asked my parents if we could figure something out for me moving out of the room. They had told me that they were not willing to get in the middle of it, and that we needed to sort it out for ourselves. My idea for sorting it out, I would just move my bed out of the bedroom and down into what was basically an entry landing for the basement. It wasn't really large enough to be a room, and it was just there as a place to store things outside of the laundry room, but to me it was the best option. At least, that's what I thought. It didn't take long for me to really understand how bad of an idea it was to set up my bed in the basement. About 2 nights into this new agreement, my sister and I were up late watching some dumb TV show on Netflix, and I decided that I needed to head to bed. I said goodnight and headed down onto the landing to get dressed, and shut off the light before lying down to go to sleep. No more than a few minutes after lying down, I heard a voice say, "What are you doing?" in a deep, whispering tone. I opened my eyes and looked over to my doorway thinking my sister had come down, and I started to say, "I'm going to sleep," when I noticed that no one was there. I shook it off after a moment, thinking I was just losing my mind, when I heard it again. But this time, it said, "You're not welcome here." At this point in time, my guess was that it was just a spirit trying to mess with me, since my mom was into the witchy stuff and all of her occult stuff was in the room next to me, the laundry room. I just assumed it was some spirit that had been attached to something that she owned, or was brought forward by something that she did, and they were messing with me. Continuing to think that it was just a spirit, I told them that this was my house, and that it was welcome to stay, but that I had power over it as this was my domain. I don't know why I felt the need to tell it that I had the power. I just remember that being something I needed to do. I kind of sat up and waited to see if this thing was going to cause me any more problems, when I noticed what looked like a hand coming out from underneath the laundry room door. When I say a hand, it seriously looked like a person's hand, but it was pitch black, and it was reaching out toward me from under the door. I stood up and opened the door to see what the hell this thing was, but when I did, there was nothing there. Obviously, I wasn't feeling too good about any of this, but I again just thought I was dealing with the basic spirit or ghost, and I was pretty tired. I told it that I wasn't scared of it, and that I was going to sleep. and then I lied back down and pulled the blanket over me. This is when it got genuinely terrifying. I felt the blanket shift slightly, and as soon as I leaned up to look, I felt a hand grab my ankle and pull me toward the laundry room. And when I say that it pulled, it absolutely felt like an adult grabbing my leg and trying to yank me away from my bed and into another room. I freaked out and ran over to the stairs and just stared at my bed thinking, what the hell was that? I gave up and decided that I would just sleep on the couch and then move my stuff back into the bedroom in the morning. The next morning, when I woke up, I thought maybe I was just dreaming it, or that it was just my brain being stupid, but then I looked down at my ankle. My right ankle, the one that was grabbed the previous night, had a massive bruise on it, about the size of a very large hand. The bruise wrapped around my entire ankle, and it kind of looked like the sort of bruise you would get if you were grabbed too hard or held down by someone. And this solidified that whatever this was likely not a good spirit, and was probably demonic. I told my mother about it. I showed her the bruise, and she said that she would cleanse the basement. She did her cleansing and said that it was all good, but I didn't go back down there to sleep. I immediately moved everything back into my sister's room and just told her that she was going to have to deal with it. After that event, I never went back into the laundry room, or even really down those stairs, because every time I would hit the top step, I would feel like something was down there and waiting for me. This was honestly the most terrifying night of my life, and was probably my most solid experience with the paranormal. I'm just thankful that whatever this thing was, it wasn't able to latch on to me and follow me out of the basement, because I don't know what the hell I would have done. So this was a collection of 4 potential demonic encounter stories. A group of paranormal stories that involve something that is not just standard paranormal. I thought this would be an interesting video to do. It's a little bit different from my normal paranormal stuff, and these stories definitely were pretty terrifying, so I think that whatever my intent was with these stories, I think I was successful. They're definitely creepy, so hopefully you all enjoyed them, if you can enjoy them. Hopefully they were what you all wanted. How about that? And yeah, all that stuff. If you did, please do consider hitting that thumbs up button if you like what you heard. And if you're also new to the channel, please consider scribbling to the giblins. I hope that's not an inappropriate thing I just said in like some sort of slang way. It was just me being stupid. Anyways, if you also want to support the channel, you can hit join down below, or Patreon, where for $1 a month you can get early access to content like this. Never expected, always appreciated. And then, yeah, you can also leave me a comment down below letting me know your thoughts. If you liked what you heard, which one was your favorite, which one you preferred or thought was the best, that kind of stuff. Alright. All that said, my friends, I hope you have a gorgeous rest of your day. I hope you're doing well out there. And I hope you know that you are loved, you are important, and of course you are valid. You're the best you that you can be, and you should never let anyone tell you otherwise. And I hope I see you again here soon. But until then, my friends, sleep well.